Fragments of Silicon, perfect for digging out things that are really jabbed in a little crack there.
All right, welcome to another installment of Fragments of Silicon. I'm your host, Adam. Joining me as always are Petty and Gollix. Let us get to the news. Gollix, why don't you start us off this week?
Pretty relatively low-key week, I think. My sister came up for a visit over the last weekend, so that was nice, and we got to play a game with her and her boyfriend. Nothing big this week in school. I guess Splatoon 3, the DLC for that, I think comes out tomorrow, which that'll be interesting. Obviously there was a Nintendo Direct earlier, but we're talking about that later, so I won't go into detail on that now. I think that's about it.
Okay, that's brisk. Anyway,
sorry,
Petty,
I didn't have that much time to think about it since I didn't go third.
You know I switch things up.
I know. I also generally am having a pretty uneventful week.
Okay, anyway, Petty, it's your go.
Well, sorry if I sound weird. I still have a little bit of the cold or whatever I had on Sunday, so apologies for that.
You sound better than Monday.
Fair. Yeah, for those of you who missed the Sunday reviews, Dad brought home some kind of illness and we all got it. He's still sick as a dog that he's had to take off work again today, so it's now going to become let's try and get him to a freaking doctor. The problem is he's a quote-unquote Wyoming cowboy. He doesn't need no doctor.
Ironic.
I know. So that's going to be fun. And yeah, as far as my news, the only really big thing that happened this week is apparently there was a water main break in the area, and we had no water for most of yesterday. And now we have a boil order for like the next day because water main break. So that's fun. And then apparently with Ogre, he Sunday night, Monday morning, he messaged me, "What does CPU over temperature error mean?"
That means your hard drive's dying.
Nah, the processor is getting too hot.
Oh yeah.
So first he saw Naka to see about getting it like reseated, have him help him reseat and put new paste on it, and that is not helping. So I helped him order a new cooler. Hopefully that helps, and then he can buy him a little bit of time because he's going to build a new computer anyway for the Final Fantasy XIV expansion because he's still been using his same computer he got when I think he started playing 14 in like 2011 or 12. So it'd be time for the upgrade.
Possibly.
So yeah, I've been helping him pick out parts for that, and that's going to be fun. And yeah, other than that, not really a whole lot else has been going on.
I guess it's my go.
Yes.
Okay, where to start? I guess I should mention, give an update on Mac. Like,
he's theoretically still alive.
Yeah. He's moved to temporary lodgings i.e., they put him up in the model apartment. The model of what they show the people.
Yeah, the showcase
apartment.
apartment, some places call it.
Yeah, the place that is a total fucking lie.
Yes.
Like, anyway, they're still they deflooded the place, but they're removing all the soggy bits, and I think at last bit of news was he's dealing with a bit of there might be a mold problem.
Yeah, because it's been like what, over a week?
Yeah. So the long and short of it is that the MSP show is going to be handled by Petty on this channel until such time as we know Matt can handle it again.
Uh-huh.
And that is in a time frame of God only knows. Let's see. In terms of personal news, okay. So as mentioned, my brother and his family was up here again this past weekend, helping to do some spring cleaning. We're clearing out some rooms and some storage space. It's a project that's going to take a few weeks. This past week, they were up here from Sunday to Monday, if I'm remembering correctly. No, it interfered with the Sunday Reviews broadcast. That shouldn't be the case weekends going forward when they're up here. Mainly because last week was a holiday weekend, President's Day, so they could stay longer than they were initially expecting. The big concern is March. Mainly because March is when my brother has to move out of his current place or find a roommate, but he doesn't want to stick around in his current place for a lot of bad memories, let's say. So that's being compounded with spring break.
Yeah, I imagine it'd be a bitch and a half to try and find a place to stay right now.
Well, it's further compounded by spring break because his kids are going to be off. And that means the kids are going to be up here during the week.
Fun.
And if you haven't seen where I'm going with this, it's a problem for the show. I'll flat out state it. Because, we're talking about, the kids are going to be around, like, the Wednesday we broadcast, we broadcast, that kind of thing. We have to work that out. But everything is still up in the air. Anyway, in terms of gaming news, I introduced my nephew to Classic Sonic.
Oh man!
Did he like it, or did he think the graphics were archaic?
He's a big Sonic fan. It's just he didn't know how to control anything, and unfortunately, I had to move stuff, so I couldn't show him how to control. I think next time
Classic Sonic use pretty much one button.
Yes, but I'm using the Sega Genesis collection, so it's also got inputs
all kinds of overlay buttons or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like he kept hitting the fast forward button, or the fast forward trigger in this case.
The Genesis Collection, you can use a USB Sega Genesis D-pad control pad with it if you can find one of those.
Yeah, I don't have one of those.
Yeah, I think I'm probably the only one here who does, and that's because I'm, again, a crazy Sonic fan.
Right. Point is, like, it's more I didn't have time to show him how to play.
Mhm.
It's not so much how Sonic 1 controls, it's, the buttons not to hit.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I think next time I'll load up Sonic 2 so he can play as Tails.
Right.
Provided there's time to do that, because once again,
classic little brother mode.
Yeah, because once again, he doesn't game on controllers. He games on touchscreens.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a video recently where from some guys at a convention or something where they had a demo of a game and they had a keyboard and a mouse and a controller. Yeah. And like they changed to 2 controllers because no one wanted to use the keyboard and mouse, but then they got kids who didn't even know how to use the controller. Or at least didn't originally think that was the thing to use.
Yeah, that's one of those things. That'll be probably a topic sometime later, but anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, though he did play some Among Us, and enjoyed that to a point. Like, he got bored of it after a while. I mean, that's actually like my experience with Among Us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm being honest. Anyway, so that's all the news that's fit to print this week. So merrily we shall roll along to the interview portion of the broadcast. And joining us this week is Max, independent game developer. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Doing well.
That's good.
Right. So how we like to get started here, we like to get to know the people behind the game, behind the studio sometimes. Sometimes we have what we call the solo dev.
Right, yep.
Anyway.
Which I definitely would fall into that category.
I figured as much. Point being is, like, we'd like to get your background, and we do this by asking this particular question. What got you interested in video games, both on a personal and a professional level?
Well, I've always been into retro games. For some reason, when I was a kid, I saw mostly games that were kind of old, and I really got into them. And my friends and I were into them too, and we would always design video games that were basically ripoffs of Mario and stuff like that, but with our own characters, names, and stuff. And I always wanted to make my own video games. So eventually I found out that it was possible to do on a computer, and I just started going from there.
Now, what kind of time frame are we talking about here? Because, at a certain point in time, those games were just not old.
Yeah, they were old when I got into them. They were always retro, but I didn't really know what was retro. I just knew that I liked them more than newer games. So, and then as for the time frame, when I started making games was in junior high. That's when I found out it was possible to do it. And I started teaching myself and learning from examples posted by people for Game Maker. And I would kind of like put them together or edit them a little bit to try to make my own games. And over time, I just kind of learned how to do it better.
So, did you at any point during your youth actually get to experience the retro game, the actual retro games?
What do you mean?
You mentioned that, you grew up with, a Mario-esque game.
Oh, yeah. No, I played the NES first and other systems later. They were owned by like my family members, and then my friends had like an older sibling that had them and stuff. So,
Okay. I just wanted to understand if you were playing on real hardware, if you were experiencing, like, say, the virtual console.
oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Did Adam phase out again?
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Did our guest phase out?
No, I'm here.
All right.
Okay. Things just went dead there. Weird.
Mhm.
Anyway, so at what point did you say to yourself you could, make games professionally?
There was really no point where I said that. It was always just like trying to do it, or applying for jobs, like doing freelance game development and stuff like that. I never really decided, oh, now I can do that. But I guess, it probably, I guess there was a point where I started thinking, well, why couldn't I do that? And then eventually there came a point when I saw, like when I was making a lot of Game Boy Studio stuff, and on their Discord, I saw some postings and I applied for them because I knew that my games were pretty good and got a lot of good response. So then I started working in those jobs.
Right. So, what made you focus on the Game Boy family of systems for game development?
Well, it was really kind of a coincidence, because before I started doing that, I was making games in Game Maker, and I know that Game Maker doesn't have the best reputation, but it's actually a very powerful software for 2D games, and they keep making it better. So I actually, like when I started using it, it was just like developed by one person, and eventually it was bought by a company, and then they developed it and made it more professional, and then added support for more systems. So I kept using it because it was just continuing to get more powerful, and I didn't really want to take the time to learn something like Unity or whatever. So the reason I started making a game for Game Boy Studio is because I've always been interested in making games for retro systems. I've actually always been very, very interested in the limitations of older systems and how people tried to work around the limitations. I, have always been really interested in watching YouTube videos about that. There's some really good channels about that, and just a lot of videos and stuff. And I was also very interested to learn how the games that I like worked on a code level. So, I already had that interest. And then I was in this phase where I was working a lot on a Wink for Mac and PC game. And I was trying to like promote it online and get some attention directed at it, because I thought eventually I could do a Kickstarter or just launch it and sell it. So I was in this phase where I wanted to make a game using a different like engine every weekend. And I did it with one game, and I used an engine called Bitsy that works in a web browser. It's kind of like, no, wait, it's not Bitsy. It's called Mosey. It's a lot like Bitsy, but it has more colors and it can have background music. So I made a game called Oh, I'm a Cat Now, I guess. Just very like random. I had a lot of fun, and I just did it all in one weekend. So And then the next weekend, I fixed some bugs and like whatever. But it was really my most successful game to that point. So I was excited and I wanted to keep doing it. So I did. The next one I wanted to do was a demake of Wink for Game Boy. But that one ended up getting such a good response that I ended up just feature creeping it, so it was no longer a demake and it became its own thing. And now it's a lot better than the version of Wink for Mac and PC because I feel like I learned a lot about game development and level design that really improved it, and also a lot of the limitations of working in that system made me simplify things, which I think was really helpful. So I'd actually kind of like to go back to the Wink for Mac and PC someday, but just like completely start it over and just use that as like an inspiration and take some of the ideas and level concepts and then finish it. But yeah, I'm not really like committed to the Game Boy. What I'd like to do is make a game for every retro console and also newer ones. Like I'd really love to make a game for Master System because it has a very different palette than Game Boy. For Game Boy Color, you can only have 4 colors per sprite or 4 colors per background tile. But with the Master System, it's a little different. You can have 16 colors for all sprites and 16 colors for all background tiles. So the differences of those older systems can create a lot of different things that you can do to make them look good and stuff. But I do have some more I want to do with Game Boy. For one thing, there was a big update to Game Boy Studio that I haven't been able to use because I did a lot of engine editing with Wink. So to translate it, it wouldn't work. Also, there was like increased limitations because the newer version of Game Boy Studio has a lot more flexibility with sprites and stuff. So they had to reduce the number of actors you can have on screen, which are like the enemies, items, stuff like that. So I would have had to redo a lot, and I didn't really want to because I thought I was going to finish it sooner than I did. But in the end, I would love to make a sequel to Wink in Game Boy Studio 3.1 because I have messed around with it, and it has a lot more capabilities. Like I could do a lot with it that would make this Wink look very basic and kind of like I've definitely pushed the limits of Game Boy Studio and the Game Boy in general on this game in a lot of ways. And because that's one of the things that I like about retro systems. I find that to be a really fun and rewarding puzzle. So that's one of the reasons why I like using retro systems. Like I could make retro style games in modern software, and I definitely would be interested in that. And I could make, modern games in modern software. I would love to do like hand-drawn games because I do a lot of art. So I know that I could naturally do it. And I did try to do that in the past, but at the time, the hardware was not up to it, or it was really poorly optimized. Either way, it didn't work. So I would definitely like to do that. Like, probably not like Cuphead, but like something in that vein where it's hand drawn, just in my particular art style is something I plan to do.
I mean, Cuphead is probably not a good example to emulate, if only because, that took 7 years or something to, fully form.
That and the
Right,
devs,
and that
mortgage
art style,
their house and stuff, and that's just not a path you really want to take,
Yeah, I don't have a house to mortgage, so I can't even do. So yeah, that is kind of part of the reason. Plus, I mean, Cuphead really successfully did that style. It's such a cool style, such a genius idea for them to do a game in that style. But I don't really think I could do it. Like, I don't draw in that style. I'd like to do a game with my own art style and like I actually for the Kickstarter have to do a comic, and I started doing a comic with Wink before there were even Wink games. Wink was a character that I just did a lot of stuff with, and eventually I was like, why don't I make a game with this character? So I definitely have like a style of drawing the Wink world and stuff that I would like to turn into a game eventually.
Considering that you, as I understand it here, you've already made maybe not a full-on game, but you've done let's say a prototype on the PC, and now you're developing a Game Boy Color game. What sort of elements are you still looking to transfer to the game world?
Well, I feel like from the Mac and PC prototype, I transferred most of the things that I wanted to. Actually, one of the bosses, I managed to transfer the mole boss. There are some differences and simplifications. Like for one thing, in that version, Wink can shoot up, and I have not implemented that in this game. So that's just not going to be a part of it. It's more like Mega Man shooting, where you just shoot left or right. I'm trying to think though. I mean, I actually have a lot of the same places and environments, but this game is considered to be a sequel to that game. One of the things that I'm interested in doing is kind of like showing the Wink story in like chronologically with different systems. So like if the game is for NES, it will chronologically take place before the Game Boy Color game. So everything in this Wink game comes after the game that I was working on, because that one, the goal was to make that like a Super Nintendo game. So that's kind of how I think of it, as a 16-bit game, even though it wasn't. But if I remade it, I would probably keep a little bit closer to that style or make it for Super Nintendo, or Genesis or whatever. So yeah, I brought a lot of stuff into it. There are a few enemies that I didn't bring forward, or some things that I would probably like to do. Like, for example, the overworld changed a lot in that game. The map was more like a Mario 3 type map, but things would change depending on the level, and you would kind of like be able to go to different places and stuff like that. And I haven't really done that a ton on the overworld in this game, because I don't have enough tiles or sprites to do it. So that would be something cool. And I could have done it if I had made it more like Zelda, where you go from screen to screen. And this one, I made the whole overworld one giant screen. And I probably wouldn't do that again, because it's too limiting. But I didn't really know that at the time. And at this point, I just don't think that makes sense to change. And, it's something I tell myself a lot, is save it for the sequel. If something would be too ridiculous to like change, I don't want to keep people waiting forever to get the game that they, pre-ordered.
That makes sense. And I suppose we should delve into the story and the world of Wink. I suppose we should start with Wink himself, because what exactly is this eye golem here?
Well, I definitely have this dichotomy of wanting to talk about things and wanting to keep them a little bit of a secret, because I know a lot about the Wink world, but I also like to have a lot of mystery and like discovery about the stories of what's going on. But so Wink lives in a post-apocalyptic world. He's a mutant who was given laser powers by aliens in the prototype game. And there are a lot of other Winklings, which are like creatures with an eyeball. They are all different colored and have different eye shapes. So basically, the number of them are limited by how many different eye shapes I can think of to give them. And also, their names, for the most part, all rhyme with Wink. So, like, there's Blink, which is Wink's friend, who is green and has a round eye. That's kind of like the Luigi to Wink if Wink was Mario. And then there's Pink, which is just a pink version of Wink. I have like a lot of them written down and different ideas, like Shrink, which is like a small version of Wink.
There's
So I have a lot of
Link,
like,
but Nintendo might get involved on that one.
right? Yeah, I probably can't use Link. Maybe
Yeah.
Link will be like a character everybody's like, where's Link? You know, you never see him. I don't know, but that's a funny idea.
Currently in the basement in Japan, you know which
Yeah.
one.
I'm like,
He
well,
lives
you
in
can
Japan.
you can get his cousin Zinc.
Yeah, there's a Zinc. I haven't really thought of what Zinc would be because most of the time the name kind of informs what they would be. Like Blink, like Wink is Wink because he's only one eye. So when he closes his eye, he's winking. But then Blink is like, well, he has two eyes if they're standing next together. So then they're blinking.
Like,
And then go on.
so would the evil version be Stink?
I don't think that would be the evil version. I think that would just be a stinky, dirty version that lives in like a dumpster. And because I guess now that I think about it, one thing that was more prominent in the prototype that I do kind of wish I could have made more prominent in this version was like a garbage theme. Like in this game, you pick up a lot of garbage strewn about everywhere, but there's no like level where you're like in a dumpster or something like that. So that's something I definitely want to put in not only the sequel, but the final world, which I'm working on. But I'm not exactly sure how to incorporate it because the final world actually starts out in a kind of a lush forest, which is weird. But I decided to go with it because I like to subvert the normal tropes of games that you might expect. So, like you're expecting the first world to be a grassland, but in Wink's world, it's very dry and desert-like. And then, of course, I guess it makes sense that the last world is more lush and green than, the first world, where you'd be expecting, like either volcanoes or like in the prototype, the final world was going to be a factory, which I think is kind of like Wink's version of castles or factories. But this game isn't really laid out in the same way. Like originally for the prototype, I was planning every world to have like a factory instead of a castle at the end. But that actually didn't pan out because for whatever reason, I ended up making the first world so complex and involved that I realized it would just work as its own game by itself. And there's no way I would be able to finish a game with that much complexity for every world.
I mean, not unless you got a bigger team, let's say.
Yeah, that is very true. I would have to have a big team though. Like the world was very big and everything was kind of like interconnected. Like you'd have to beat this one level and then this one thing would change so you could go to a different part of the map. But yeah, I would love to have a team someday where we could have a scope like that. But this game actually has a pretty big scope, especially for a Game Boy game. It's like on the very, very big side for a Game Boy game. Basically, the biggest cartridge size you can have, unless you're doing some very fancy things that only like 1 or 2 games did. And it's already doing fancy games to get a 4 megabit cartridge. So this game is big. It has a lot of content. Like it has a mini operating system, which is something I always like to include in my games for fun because I like old operating systems and I've always wanted to design one. So that was kind of my way of doing it. And the mini operating system is basically for checking like the items you've collected in each level or changing options. And then there's kind of like a help app. And there's a mini game that I haven't finished, but it's trying to go for like a rough version of Breakout or Pong, depending on what I can manage to accomplish in Game Boy Studio, which doesn't really have support for altering tiles. So that limits your ability to do a Breakout clone.
I suppose. I'll be honest, I don't know exactly the science behind Alleyway.
What's that?
Oh, that was Nintendo's Breakout clone.
Oh, well, the thing is, you can do things on Game Boy that you can't do in Game Boy Studio. Like, Game Boy Studio has a lot of really powerful capabilities, but one of the ones it lacks is being able to change the tiles on the screen background individually. So that's really what Alleyway and pretty much all of the Breakout clones would do, is like if you hit a brick, then they would write like empty tiles where the brick used to be. And you know, it's pretty simple, but because of the hardware limitations and the way it works, that hasn't been implemented in Game Boy Studio. Like you can change tiles, but you can change, like, say you have a water tile and you change that and it's going to change all of the water tiles, which is great for animation. But in this case, so far, I mean, one thing I will say is there have been a lot of limitations of Game Boy Studio that I myself and other people found ways around. So I'd love to try to do that with Game Boy Studio 3, but I feel like I've hit the limit of Game Boy Studio 2. And I've extended it so much that it's kind of like, I think I've done enough. Like, I think it's pretty impressive at this point. Not only for a Game Boy game, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be a Switch version that's going to be, even for a retro game, pretty innovative. So I'm pretty excited about that. But I'm not 100% sure. No contracts have been signed or anything, but it could happen. I'm in talks for it, and I think it'll be pretty awesome. So I'm actually probably the only person who's not disappointed that the Switch 2 has been delayed to next year, because I was kind of worried, like, oh no, what if, you know, this Switch 2 comes out and this, like, there's no point in releasing this. So I gotta finish that and get it out before 2025.
I mean, keep in mind, those are just rumors. Like, what actually goes on with the next Switch may not line up with those rumors.
Yeah, maybe it'll come out in 2026.
I mean, seeing people were saying that the original Switch was supposed to be as powerful as the PS5 in some early rumors.
Yeah, I would never trust anything that says a Nintendo console is going to be surprisingly powerful, because they always say that, and it
hasn't
always
been that
wrong.
way since the GameCube.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think Nintendo learned from the GameCube that it would be a mistake to do that again, so they just don't do it.
Anyway, so what is Wing trying to accomplish in this game?
So, really, the main, or like the first part of the story is just Wink likes to explore. He likes to find unusual collectibles. And while he's doing that, he hears a voice calling for help. So he goes and finds this robot who has been attacked by some other creatures, and they stole different parts of the robot to use for themselves. So Wink is going around finding all of the creatures and fighting them to get the piece back for the robot.
I mean, that's about what I would expect from a Game Boy game.
Right. I'm not really into like really involved stories or a lot of cutscenes. I'm more interested in like ambiance and like environmental storytelling. That's what I really like to do. Like I like to tell those stories about the world by showing what like in this case a lot of it is about like what did this place used to be like, because this is a post-apocalyptic world where there are few if any humans, and there's a lot of junk left over from when humans were around. So there are a lot of places that have been kind of repurposed, like this factory that is not being used for a factory. And it's been infested with like animals and plants and stuff like that. So that's where my storytelling energy goes to. I'm not really interested in like dialogue and exposition. I don't really care for that in games too much. I'd say Earthbound is probably the game that I liked the most with the most exposition and dialogue, and I think it, is an amazing game. But for me, I'm a little bit more in like the Mario style of game where you just play it, but there is a little bit of storytelling because of that environmental storytelling, and you'll find like relics from the past, or you'll go into a mountain and then you'll find that it used to be a mall and stuff like that. So that's the kind of thing that I think is really interesting. And when I play games, a lot of the time I get annoyed if there's too much like dialogue, especially before you even start the game. So I kind of am in some ways making games for myself, like using my taste to determine what do I like. And of course, I do a lot of play testing and ask a lot of people their opinions. So I did add a little bit, like I'm doing intro cutscene because a lot of people didn't like the fact that the game just kind of starts you out and like there was no purpose. And to me, that's not an issue at all. I don't care that much about the story in games most of the time. But I'm also maybe more than most people totally okay with like in a movie not really knowing what's happening and kind of figuring it out. Like I really like David Lynch's movies, and he's very much about like not really telling you what's going on sometimes at all. Like with a lot of his stuff, you have no clue what you just watched, and there's no reason, you don't really need to know. Like the mystery is part of the thing that makes it cool. Like trying to think out like what was that? What did that mean? That's the kind of thing I really like. And so but I knew what the story was for the game when I started making it. Like I didn't know it immediately. I started building the world first, and then I sort of started to come up with like the metaphor for a broken robot as like kind of like how I was feeling, like kind of a person who needed a lot of healing and stuff like that. So that was kind of what gave me the idea for that story. But I wouldn't say the metaphor is very explicit in the game. And I also wouldn't say that, like, I thought for a while maybe like each piece could represent like something a person needs to heal from trauma or something. But so far, that hasn't really been the case. The pieces have actually more been like, why would this creature want that piece and what are they using them for? And then you kind of like have to deal with the effects they're using of the piece. And sometimes they're almost nonsensical. Like the mole enemy has used a magnifying lens somehow to make itself really big. So it's like, that's kind of like dream logic of how a magnifying lens could work, but it's not like real. There's, but it kind of follows some kind of dream logic in a way.
I mean, this approach makes sense because not only are we talking about a Game Boy game here, we're talking about a platformer. A straight old school exploratory, jump around platformer. When I think of side scrollers and platformers with an emphasis on narrative, I think modern indie games, honestly. Not so
Yeah,
much, anything on the Game Boy.
totally.
Really.
And I'm not really necessarily trying to make a game that would be appropriate for the Game Boy. I mean, let me rephrase that. I'm not trying to make a game that's like perfectly as if it could have come out then. Like somebody asked me, why are there modern pieces of technology in this game? Like there are like iPods and stuff. And the whole purpose of that is to show like, well, think about it. If in like 100 or 1,000 years, when our society has collapsed, what's going to be left over from that? It's going to be things that people bought millions of copies of. And any people living there, they're going to have no clue what they were even for. So I find that to be kind of interesting. Um, but yeah, I'm not necessarily trying to make a game that's like really fits into the concept of what a Game Boy was. I'm actually a little bit more interested in pushing the boundaries and trying to do things that haven't been done that much or subverting things. Like, for example, the game itself is a little bit interesting because there's this top-down overworld that's kind of like a light Zelda, and then the levels are in you discover them in that overworld, kind of like in the Zelda games where you go into a dungeon. But in my game, the dungeons are worlds, and then you have to beat like 3 levels. Depending on the world, there are some exceptions, but I don't know. I thought that would be kind of interesting and fun. And then there are another thing that I thought would be cool would be to have some mixture of platforming and top down in the levels. I didn't really do that very much, but I did do it a little bit because I thought it would be a very interesting and unexpected thing. I've never seen that in a game.
And did that work out well to your satisfaction?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm still kind of working with the levels that switch perspectives. I'm trying to find a way to make it a little bit more clear what's happening because some people have been confused by it. One person didn't understand that the perspective had switched. So they were trying to still play like it was a platformer and having no clue why it wasn't working right. So, that's something I think about. And somebody else just didn't like it. They didn't say they were confused by it, but they didn't like it. So, when I get any kind of feedback, I definitely put it in kind of like place in my mind where I'm like, how can I address that problem? I don't necessarily always want to change things that people ask me to change because sometimes those things are pretty fundamental to what I'm trying to do. But then other times they're not. Like, for example, I've been getting a lot of feedback on the controls not feeling as responsive as some people want. Like, I worked pretty hard on the controls, and I think for the Game Boy community, they feel pretty good. But as it gets out into the wider world, there's more criticism. So I'm like, okay, how can I make the controls really good for people? So that's something I'm working on right now. I mean, when I say controls, it's more like the physics. Like
Yeah.
one thing that one of my playtesters pointed out today was like my jump in Wink is a lot slower than like the jump in Mario. So for whatever reason, it didn't bug me, but maybe that's it. So I'm gonna keep like testing it, asking for feedback until we get something that has a good feel because physics are so important in a platformer. Like really, you can put all of the cool things in it, but if people don't like the way the movement feels, then it's almost pointless because they're not even get to the cool stuff.
And you are aiming to have this run on original hardware, right?
Oh yeah, it absolutely runs on original hardware. I have my little flasher and test card and everything. So not only does it run on Game Boy Color, but I also have put work into making sure it runs on black and white Game Boy.
Because I know sometimes there were games back in the day when they did the perspective change, and either they didn't test it well or what, it just didn't like look good or feel good. So I didn't know if that's
Hmm.
also been tested on actual hardware.
Well, what games are you talking about? Because I'd definitely be interested in
What
looking
was
into
it?
that.
I need to find it. It's been a while.
Okay. Well, the perspective change, I mean, technically works because there's it's really like you go to a different room and it's top down instead of a platformer. And there's no technical limitation for that. There's no reason you shouldn't be able to do it. Now, you couldn't really, I mean, maybe there would be a way, but it would be very challenging to change the perspective in one room because it's tile based. So it doesn't really have that kind of 3D capability unless you're doing some very trickery type stuff. Because there are some 3D games for Game Boy, but that's the kind of thing you can't do with Game Boy Studio because you're not at the bare hardware when
Yeah.
you're working
And
on it.
like some of that crazy stuff you need to put extra chips in the cartridge for.
Yeah,
Game Boy
absolutely.
Game Boy Studio it basically assumes a basic cartridge.
Hmm. Absolutely. And like there are some extra things like you can get an RTC, which is a real-time clock.
Hmm.
But the thing is, a lot of bootleg cartridges have had that because that's a requirement for some Pokemon games.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things in bootleg cartridges kind of trickle down because you can use bootleg cartridges. Like you can buy like a bootleg game and then flash over it. And that's actually one of the things that I did for testing my game before. So I could like test the game on real hardware.
Hmm.
I suppose it's also worth asking, what's the current state of the game? Like, how far along is it in development?
It's getting there. Um, I'm working on finishing the final world, and then I have a lot of bosses that I haven't done, and then I have some like smaller details to implement, but it's getting really close. Like I can really see the end kind of as like like if you're walking in a forest and you can kind of start to see the light coming from the edge of the trees or something like that. That's kind of how it feels.
And as I understand it, this game was the subject of a Kickstarter campaign a few months back.
Right.
What was the purpose of that?
The main purpose of the Kickstarter was to get funding so I could work on it instead of always having to do like freelancing and other stuff like that. I felt like that was taking a lot of time away from the game. Also, there really wouldn't have been, I mean, at least as much of a physical aspect without the Kickstarter. I did get a game published that I made kind of like in the middle of Wink called Ruby and Rusty Save the Crows, which is a lot like Wink in some ways. Like it's a platformer, but it's like a very small version, like more like a standard sized Game Boy game. And originally I made that for a contest and I didn't win, but I had like pretty much a complete short Game Boy sized game and eventually got it published with a pretty cool company that has published a lot of games from different systems. And
Give them a minute.
it's called Bitmap Games, or Bitmap Soft, I mean.
Trying to think if we've spoken to them before.
I vaguely remember hearing the name before, but I don't know if that's on the looking to get list or the we've already had list.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
They're a pretty prolific publisher out of the UK, so
Like-
definitely could be good to have them on the show.
Probably. It's just, we have so many people on that it gets hard to remember who has graced us with their presence. Anyway, so the Game Boy Color version of Wink here, is it only going to be a Game Boy Color game, or are you going to release it on, modern platforms?
I'm gonna release it on modern platforms, absolutely, and modern consoles as much as possible. I'm pretty confident there's going to be a Switch version. And also, already right now, I have it on itch.io where you can play the beta either on your computer or your phone. I would like to have like an actual app version. Right now, it's just on a website. And then for your phone, it comes up with like a little control pad and stuff. It's pretty cool, but it's definitely a lot harder to control on a touch screen. Touch screens really are not ideal for platform games, but it's there if you want it, and it's still pretty fun on there, so that's cool. But yeah, I'd love to get it on all of the systems I possibly can. I know that I've at least heard that other systems like Xbox and maybe I don't know, PS4 don't allow emulation, and if they don't allow emulation, it's not going to happen.
I don't think that's accurate, because I know a lot of emulated stuff is ended up on those services.
I think you need to provide your own like built-in emulation. You can't use like a third-party emulator to emulate it.
Right. I mean, yeah, in general, like you don't want to be using like NES on any commercial platform officially.
Okay, that's really good, because if possible and if there are publishers interested, most of the publishers I've spoken to have been mostly focused on the Switch, and I guess that makes sense, maybe just because it's like Nintendo, and also because there's probably more of a connection for retro related publishers with Nintendo, since neither of the other consoles really have like much of a retro history anymore. Since retro games seems to be mostly made up of like Sega and Nintendo.
Well, I guess
for
it
now.
depends how retro you want to get. Technically, the PS3 is considered retro now, and that makes people's skin want to fall off.
Sony has a retro history. It's much harder to tap into the PlayStation 1 aesthetic and play style than it is to do anything 8-bit or 16-bit, because this is two-dimensional gameplay.
My opinion about that era is that it was basically like the Atari of 3D. Like nobody has that much nostalgia for Atari games because they just didn't look good, and there's nothing about it.
Yeah,
but
most
then
of them
again,
get remade in almost like an NES style, not an Atari style.
But I have seen some people who do like it, so
I mean, I know people who would vehemently disagree with this.
Yeah.
But I definitely think I'm right. Like, I think that early 3D era, Nintendo 64, PlayStation, it just looks very bad, very primitive, and personally, I just don't like it. But then, like, later on, like,
I think the bigger problem with the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64 were some of the effects that were going on at the time. It's not so much low poly, but with the PlayStation, for example, it was infamous for its warping of textures that just looked awful. And the N64 had so much anti-aliasing, everything looked like it had Vaseline on it.
And if
Yeah,
it
low
did,
poly
it
is
had angles that looked
interesting.
like you could kill yourself on.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because you can make low poly games that look really good. I think it also could be low resolution, but also a big one is just like their textures are too small. Yeah, like you said, on the Nintendo 64, it's like really blurred. Where on PlayStation, it's really warped. That's interesting though. I wonder, like, also I think maybe it could have been due to aesthetic culture at that time. Like a lot of the low poly games I see that look really cool and look really good have really good use of color. And at that point in time, it seemed like they were trying to go for like a gritty look on PlayStation most of the time, or like a really cartoony look on Nintendo 64 that uses like colors that I just don't think are really appealing to me. Like when you look at them all together. But I don't know. It's very personal and like opinion based because but that's just kind of how I feel. Like maybe the reason I don't like that is because it's like Atari. Like Atari was an 8-bit system, but it just took some time to get the 8-bit looking as good as it did on the NES. So that's kind of what I like to think about it.
I'm sure this there is an entire debate to be had with this, but that might be a bit outside the purview of what we're talking about here. Like
maybe, yeah.
Anyway, so have you thought about any sort of pricing for Wink yet?
Yeah, so right now you can pre-order it. And the pricing is pretty much the same as the Kickstarter. Like the Kickstarter had a early bird discount where every tier or whatever you want to call it had reduced prices for a while. But right now, the physical version, complete in box with like the manual and the cartridge and the stickers, it also comes with the digital ROM and soundtrack download and everything digital. That's $60. And then the cartridge only version is $30 and digital only is $15. And you know, there could be sales for the digital only version. But that's what I'm at like now. And I know that is a little bit pricey, but that's just the economics of it. Like
Getting Game Boy
manufacturing
cartridges made is expensive.
Yeah, it's really expensive.
There's a reason
The
why
cartridges,
Nintendo made you buy them in sets of 10,000.
yeah, absolutely. And you know, now I'm imagining it's even more expensive because there's no like big factories making them. They're like smaller companies. They're doing different runs. There's complexity there, so it's very pricey. And the cartridge components are the most expensive part. And then, you know, also when it comes to like the complete in box version, you know, you're getting a box, you're getting a manual, everything's printed in color. I spent a lot of time and energy designing it. So it's not like the physical versions are not a mass market product. They're for people who are either really obsessed with Game Boy games or they're really obsessed with my games and they want like a very special version of the game. And then the digital versions, which I'll be selling on like Steam and everything else like that, that's going to be more mass market. That's going to be like a game for whatever, you know, and I'll price that accordingly and look at like what other games they're charging and, you know, the content and stuff like that. Right now, $15 seems fair. We'll see, but I probably don't want to reduce it too much because then people who already bought it are going to be like, oh no, why didn't I get the better price? So we'll see. But there will be sales. So if people are like really broke, you know, wait for a sale. Someday there will be one, maybe like 2 or 5 years from now.
And do you have any sort of release date in mind?
Well, my tentative release date is April, which is possible that I could still make it. I'd really like to, and I'm trying really hard to, but it's really hard to say. It's really hard to gauge how much time things are going to take to make in a game. And then on the other point, there's like bug testing. And originally I had a dedicated bug tester and that was going to get paid through the Kickstarter, but they had to drop out of the project and I haven't been able to find anybody to replace them. So I've had a lot of like more like hobbyist bug testers, but I was kind of planning on having this guy because he was very, very good at finding tons of bugs. And that is really helpful.
Yeah.
So
Proper
bug
QA
testing
is a pain in the ass.
yeah, it's a lot of time and work. I remember when I did the Q&A for Ruby and Rusty, it was with him, and it was hard. They say the final 10% is the hardest work, and I could definitely kind of agree with that from that part. So that's why I say it's really hard to know. And like another thing is, since this is going on physical cartridges, I don't really want to release a buggy game. Like, you know, technically it's possible for people to reflash their cartridges, but that's not realistic to expect people to do. So I want to do it right and get people like a good quality game. So
Because these
I'm
are
trying,
like actual like retail style cartridges, not like a flash cart.
right. I mean, I guess most of the time, like now, you can still reflash them because they're technically flash or like ROM, but even ROM a lot of the time is rewritable. It's just rewritable a limited number of times.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting fact that I did not know before. That yeah, you can rewrite ROM most of the time, at least a few times, but you know, they don't call it ROM, or they call it ROM because you're not supposed to do that very many times. So yeah, a lot of the manufacturers I've spoken to have said that they can be flashed. Like, and part of the reason I asked that was because I wanted to get all of the pieces as soon as possible. But there was a delay, so I'm still working on getting that piece, but I know where I'm getting it from. I just have to like finalize the order and stuff like that.
Yeah, sign the
This
paper,
month.
get the product, so on and so forth.
Right. And one of the things is, since the game isn't done, they're not going to be manufacturing it right away. So, you know, I'm kind of into the idea of paying a deposit so they have it for me when I need it. But for a while I was thinking maybe I would just, you know, flash them all myself, because at least one of the ones I was talking to said that I could do that. But then another one of the manufacturers I was talking to said they could do it for a nominal fee. And I think that would make a lot more sense, because otherwise it's just going to take forever. And, you know, I think it'll be a lot more reliable if they do it, because sometimes when you're flashing by yourself, something could go wrong. But I imagine they have like very professional equipment to use for that.
I think some places actually have like decommissioned like stuff that Nintendo would have used.
Oh, that's a cool idea. You know,
Like,
it
so they
makes
can do like
perfect
the whole
sense.
mass transfer. They're not just like what you'd be doing, just popping cartridges in and out of the flasher.
Mhm.
They
Right.
could do batch flashes.
Yeah, which is probably, you know, a huge time saver.
Yeah, if you can do like even 5 or 6 cartridges in the time it takes you to do one.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I did with the CD. Soundtrack CD was a reward for some of the tiers, and I bought a CD burner that plugs into USB, and I was like, well, I could do that. But then I was like, it would probably just be way more effective to get it them manufactured. And I think it was, because
Yeah.
then they printed the labels and everything, and it looks good too. So
Oh yeah, I've seen those like mass CD copier things that places can use, and those are nice.
that's cool. Where'd you see it?
Um, when I was in high school, we had a computer repair like course run by one of the community colleges, and they had
Hmm,
one of those mass copiers there they used for like data duplication and backing up for like some of the school's files and stuff like that.
that's cool.
Right. So, Golix, do you have any questions?
I think you've asked most of the things I've thought of.
All right. All right. So, as engaging as this conversation has been, it is time to wrap up. Um, so, Max, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule and being with us here today. It's been a very lovely and thought-provoking conversation about your game.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No problem. We look forward to seeing how it shapes up, and hopefully it can meet its April release window. So the game is Wink and the Broken Robot.
Yes.
Where can you pre-order this?
You can pre-order a physical or digital version. Let me get the exact link. I just created it. It's maxoakland.bigcartel.com. You could also purchase like the itch.io beta right now, and then you'll get the digital version on maxoakland.itch.io. So either way, you can do that, and you can also play the beta right now on maxoakland.itch.io on a computer or a phone or whatever. And I have some other games up there too.
Okay, so if you are inclined to do so, go and do that today.
Right. Yeah, do it today.
Right, so that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. We'll move the Nintendo Direct stuff to MSP. So with that in mind, coming up on the week ahead, if I can get to the right page here. I hate it when that happens. But no, that's not it. Let's see, almost there. Yeah. No, that's last month. Here we go. Coming up on Friday, February 23rd, we'll be having Tiago Zaiden of GameCraft Studios. Right, so they have quite a few games to their name, but we've actually covered a couple of them last year, as they are the developers of Vampire Hunters, of which is getting a update here very soon. In fact, that's what's keeping the videos that I was supposed to get for the broadcast. And they're also the developers of Bit Trip Rerunner, which we reviewed last year. So I'm looking forward to that. And coming up on the Sunday reviews, we will be covering Book of Demons, Despair Blood Curse, Spearmaster, and Nullum. So until next time, I shall wish you good gaming.